Hey guys, welcome back to the My Sugar Free Journey podcast. I am here today with Dr. Jerry Pollack. So, Dr. Pollack has received his PhD in biomedical engineering from the University of Pennsylvania in 1968. He is the founding editor in chief of the journal Water, and we're going to be talking a lot about water today. He's written several books. He wrote a book in 1990 on muscles and molecules, a book in 2001 called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And his newest book, the one that really got him on my radar today, The Fourth Phase of Water, Beyond Solid, Liquid, and Vapor. And it won that I forget what society's, the Distinguished Award, their highest distinction. And it went on to receive the World Summit Excellence Award. So this is been a well-received book with some very interesting ideas that we're going to get into today. So Dr. Pollack, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks, Aaron. It's great to be with you. And
fantastic. So you're covering a very I guess anytime we have a new idea, it can be a complicated idea for people who aren't familiar with it. So can you explain to us, why are you pushing the idea of a fourth phase of water? What is that, and why should anyone be interested in it?
Well, people should be interested because this is a fundamental feature of nature. You know, we learn as students, even when we're children or middle school, we learn that water has three phases. It has a solid phase, which is ice, and a liquid phase, which we drink, and a vapor phase, which we can find in the environment. And for many years, people have expressed doubt that this really does the job, because there are many features that are not explained properly by a framework of understanding that embraces three phases. Even 100 years ago, there were some physical chemists who were saying, you know, there are a lot of anomalies. Anomalies are observations that don't fit the theory. They're kind of dismissed, pushed aside as anomalies. And now the number of anomalies, when you deal with three phases of water, there's a list somewhere on the web, and it amounts to, I think, something like 60 or 65 of major anomalies, major features that don't fit. And so this is the first point, is that the theory is there are three phases, but there are lots of observations that don't fit the theory. So you need to start thinking along other lines. But that's not, in fact, what really led us to uncovering a fourth phase of water. It was in fact, you might say, a mentor of mine, even though we didn't work together. But his name is Gilbert Ling. And Gilbert Ling had, by the time I got to know him, he's now 100 years old, by the way.
Oh,
he's,
wow.
Yeah, celebrating his 100th birthday. And by the time I met him, he'd already written 3 or 4 books. And his major thesis was that inside the living cell, the water was not like water in here, not like drinking water, where the molecules, this is obviously a liquid, and the molecules take on random positions with respect to one another, and they're jiggling around numerous times every second, and that's the general characterization of water like this. He said, no, it's different. Inside the cell, the water molecules are actually lined up next to the large molecules that are inside the cell. And they're lining up, forming like a series of lined up dominoes or such. This was his thesis, and I became seriously interested in this because I thought he had a good point. And even when I first met him, he had numerous supporters. I met him at a meeting in Budapest. The meeting was to commemorate the work of a famous biophysicist. And this guy was famous for 2 things. He was famous for his work on muscles, and he was famous for his work on water. And I was attending to represent the topic of muscle, because I was interested at the time in that subject. And I met a whole bunch of people who were interested in water, who were followers of Gilbert Ling. And I was really impressed by the evidence that they had favoring a different kind of water that's inside the cell. So much so that I decided to write a book because I thought a book was needed. And it's a book that you mentioned. It's called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And the original reason for writing that book was simply to elaborate Gilbert Ling's ideas on this kind of water where the molecules are organized. He called it structured, other people called it ordered. And I gave one of his books to all the people in my laboratory at the time, postdocs and students, and they all came back to me and said, if this guy is not right, he must be very close to being right, because this makes total sense and the evidence fits. And so I wrote the book, and the book went somewhat beyond what Gilbert had written. Gilbert's writing is not always so accessible, and the idea was to write a book that was more accessible. But I went beyond what Gilbert was suggesting, and I went beyond to adduce evidence that the water, this so-called structured or ordered water, was so important for practically every activity that happens inside the cell, or every action of a particular cells, like muscle cells contracting or nerve cells conducting, and et cetera, secretory cells secreting, that the water, the ordered water, and in fact the change of the ordered water into ordinary water, like the stuff I just mentioned, that transition was very important for central, fundamental for triggering various cellular activities. And so that's where it all started, and we began doing experimental research, and we found some, I think, astonishing things from. So that's how it all began. And
so let me make sure that I kind of understand here. You're saying that once we drink water or whatever goes into our bodies, once it gets into our cells, it loses the randomness that you would see in a glass of water, and it starts lining itself up and structuring itself within the cells. For what purpose?
Well, that's a really good question. I guess I haven't really explained very much about the fourth phase, but it relates to your question about purpose. And let me start the answer by saying the purpose, I think, is to create energy storage. Okay, and let me explain why that's important. So, and that storage of energy is then ready to be delivered to the cell. And I understand the current view about cell energy is that it comes through the splitting of molecule ATP. That's where we get our energy.
That's what I was going to ask. When you're talking about energy, you're talking about electrical energy? You're talking about ATP energy? Is it like a chemical energy?
I'm talking about electrical energy.
Electrical, okay. Basically,
it's electrical energy. There have been some questions about the accepted energy as storage route, the ATP. Of course, it's in every textbook, and most people would find no reason to doubt it. However, Gilbert Ling cites some pretty interesting papers after the idea was published that ATP has a high energy bond, and that bond could be used to supply energy for the cell. There was a paper that followed within 1 year that challenged that conclusion, and it was challenged on the basis that the authors of the original conclusion made a mistake, a very simple arithmetic mistake, and that led to a conclusion that was not correct. And so almost nobody has paid any attention at all to that challenge. It's worth going back and reading the paper that demonstrated that there was a problem, the original assertion. And Gilbert Ling on his website, gilbertling.org, talks about that. And I'm not sure if the challenge is correct or not correct, but we've identified another source of energy, and that is, as you point out, that is electrical energy. So this fourth phase of water, it different from what Gilbert Ling had suggested. We think the evidence points to the fact that this water comes in, it builds in sheets. Each sheet, if you look down on the sheet, is a hexagonal structure, a honeycomb, six-pointed a structure that repeats again and again. And and one sheet is built on the sheet prior to it. So many sheets build up, and this is the nature. We call it EZ water because we found that this kind of water excluded, so therefore excluded many solutes and particles. So we called it exclusion zone, or EZ for short, easy to remember. So, and sometimes we call it fourth phase water. So it's a bit different from what Gilbert Ling suggested. But the one observation that really surprised us is that this water typically has negative charge. It's not neutral like ordinary water. And what happens in order to build it is that the water molecule splits into the positive and negative parts, the positive part being protons, H plus, and the negative part, OH minus. So, you put the H plus, OH minus together, and that gives you H2O. But there's something that splits it, and the OH minuses then gather together to form what we call the fourth phase, or EZ water, and it's negatively charged. And the H pluses, the protons, are pushed out of that, and they lodge inside what we call bulk water, just beyond the exclusion zone. So you have a zone, and this zone is negatively charged and ordered, highly ordered. Then you have a positive zone beyond. It's like a battery, you see, and this battery holds potential energy. And this potential energy is delivered every time the cell does what it's designed to do. And that would be for a muscle cell, for example, that contracts, or a secretory cell that secretes, et cetera, et cetera. So in response to your question, which is an interesting question, why does the cell do this? I mean, I'm not Mother Nature, so I can't give you a definitive answer, but the best answer I have is that this is the way that the cell stores energy and then uses the energy to do its work.
Okay, so when you've observed this phenomenon in a lab, I've looked at some of your stuff. You're looking at it like you've got water in a beaker or something. You're looking at this exclusion zone is right next to the glass, correct? It's that first, I don't know, bazillionth of a millimeter next to the glass. Is that correct?
First of all, it's not a bazillionth.
Okay, I don't know. How thick is that exclusion?
You can call it a gazillionth if you like, or whatever, but actually it's pretty sizable. So we've seen exclusion zones that are as big as a millimeter. Typically,
really?
Depending on, usually they grow next to surfaces, next to hydrophilic surfaces or water-loving surfaces. If you have such a surface in the horizontal plane and you drop water, it spreads out. That's hydrophilic, because loving of water. It loves it so much that it will find itself adjacent to as much of it as possible. So the water spreads out, but as it spreads out, it builds these layers. And these layers, in our lab, routinely, we can see in a typical experiment more than 1 million of these layers. So it's not a gazillionth at all. It's a very large fraction that can build, that doesn't necessarily build, but we in typical cases that we see in the lab, it's very big, substantial.
So when you're talking about
yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but when you're talking about the like a cell in the body, I mean it's been a long time since I've had biology, but a typical cell, isn't the membrane of that cell mostly fat, and isn't fat mostly hydrophobic?
Yeah, but we're not talking now. Well, a few comments on that. Okay. First of all, the outer surfaces are actually hydrophilic. The hydrophobic is in the middle. The hydrophobic moieties are in the middle of the membrane thickness, but the surfaces are actually hydrophilic. But okay. I'm not seriously talking about this EZ water growing next to the membrane, although it certainly should. I'm talking about the EZ water existing next to probably every macromolecule inside the cell. So the cell is filled with this kind of water. The cell is filled, and this water, as I said, has negative charge, and so we think that the reason why every cell has negative charge is not the way the textbook will tell you, that it has to do with membrane pumps and channels.
Yeah.
We think there is good reason to suggest that it's just the water, that this easy or fourth phase water that fills the cell that has negative charge. So if you've got a sac filled with molecules that have negative charge, of course, you stick an electrode in and you're going to measure negative electrical potential. So it's not the membrane, although the membrane may certainly participate in growing this stuff, but everything pretty much inside the cell, usually the hydrophilic or charged surfaces are exposed to the water. And these surfaces then nucleate the buildup of easy water. So your cells and my cells are pretty much filled with easy water.
Okay, so the typical explanation of how a cell gets power in your biology textbook is something along the lines of there's a membrane, there's electrons on one side of the membrane, there's no electrons on the other side of the membrane, and there's a series of channels that the body uses to bring those electrons into the cell to power all of the whatever that all of the stuff. There's a ton of stuff that has to go on inside each individual cell, and that's what ATP does. Is it donates the electrons basically for the electrical charge. So what you're saying is, or for, I guess I should say for the chemical charge, just to keep it separate. But what you're saying is that those channels, those things that are actually bringing in the electrons, those aren't like a biological physical structure. That this is the whole process is being mediated by these lattices of fourth phase water. That's what's allowing these electrons to pass through the membrane. Am I close? The look on his face says no, guys. I don't know if you're watching the video. I wasn't even close.
Well, okay. I mean, there's a lot to say about it. The first question is about the channels.
Okay.
And I'm sorry to be so radical in my thinking, but
no, you're fine. I'm trying to get to the bottom of this.
Well, I think the channels don't exist.
Okay. Oh, okay. That is radical.
Yeah, I mean now I've lost total count, but I think the number of channels that are proposed to be in the membrane somehow exceeds 1,000 or something more than that. And the first question is there enough room for all of these channels in the membrane? Okay, this is a serious consideration. But more than that, think of the logic. So each channel is specific for a given solute or a given ion. Right? Otherwise, you would need a separate one for each ion. And think of the problem. Think of the channel that's specific for the largest solute for which there is a putative channel. Okay, so let's say it's the size of a basketball. So you've got a channel and you've got basketballs outside the cell, and the channel pops open and the basketball goes through. So when it opens to let the basketball through, the question is, how does it prevent the golf balls and softballs and hard balls and such from passing through at the same time? So you have to invent a mechanism that's capable of doing that. And it's not just capable of doing it for the basketball, but for the next smallest ball, you got to do the same thing for all the solutes that are smaller, and the next smaller one, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it means the burden on figuring out a mechanism as to how this could possibly work, it boggles the mind. And I do know that there's one proposal about sodium and potassium, distinguishing those two, but it's not just for those two. It's for every single channel that necessarily must exclude all the solutes that are smaller. It's kind of like the dog door that you have, in your house, so the dog can go out or in. And when the dog door opens, what prevents the cats and the mice and whatever from going in and out at the same time? It's that kind of problem. So it's illogical. And let me say one more thing. The membrane is said to have pumps and channels. So the pumps are for pumping various ions and solutes in or out. And I'm told by students of this that there are now more than something like 2,000 of these. Imagine 2,000 of these spread around the surface of a cell. And Gilbert Ling himself, in his own experiments, he pulled the plug on all the power to the cell. In other words, he poisoned the cell. And though he poisoned the cell, still the apparent effects of pumping were still felt for 8 hours or something like that, the separation of ions. And he said, well, there's no energy to run these pumps. Pumps need energy. And so that was when there was only one pump that was identified. It was the sodium pump, and now we have 2,000 of them. So if there's not enough energy to run the sodium pump in the cell, how are you going to run 2,000 pumps? So the whole concept, to summarize, the whole concept of channels and pumps, although widely accepted by almost everybody, I think is erroneous. And also, just I guess a final point on that is, you can compare a cell to a gel. The inside of the cell has a membrane, and all of these various pumps and channels are said to lodge in the membrane, and they're responsible in theory for the negative electrical potential inside the cell. But if you take a gel, it has no membrane at all, you find the same electrical potential, more or less, inside the gel as inside the cell. Many people, including our lab, have measured this. So if the cell is, say, minus 80 or 90 millivolts, the gel is minus 100 or 110 or 130, has no membrane. So if anybody is suggesting that in the cell, it's the pumps and the channels that are responsible for creating this electrical potential, then there has to be another mechanism for why the gel has the same electrical potential, although it has no channels and pumps, obviously, because it has no membrane. So I'm pretty skeptical about the current view on why the cells all have negative electrical potentials. And I think a simpler argument stems from the idea that the water inside the cell, practically all the water, is easy water, which typically has negative charge. So it's a very simple kind of interpretation. And if your cell has less negative charge, smaller negative electrical potential, then it has less easy water. So I'm sorry, that's a long answer to a short question, but you haven't asked me yet, where does the energy come from to build this structure? But maybe
I'm definitely going to ask that here in just a minute. But before we get to that, I have one more question. So apply everything that you just said to the easy water. How does the easy water, how is it able to differentiate between the different solutes that need to come into the cell?
Well, that's a good question. And basically most of them were excluded from the cell, and not all. For example, potassium is inside the cell is high. I don't really answer to the potassium. Gilbert Ling comes up with a suggestion that the potassium fits into the lattice of structured water. That might be correct, might not, but almost everything else tends to be excluded. And it's easy to understand that, because in the exclusion zone, or easy water that's inside the cell, it tends to exclude virtually all solutes. So it's easy to understand why they're all out. However, as I mentioned earlier, when the cell springs to life and does its thing, like a muscle cell, it goes from relaxation to contraction, or a secretory cell secretes, the water, the trigger for all this is in my Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life book, the trigger for all of this is a transition from this kind of water to ordinary water, you see. And when the cell transiently, when the water in the cell becomes ordinary water, anything can diffuse through it, in or out. It's just like a standard solution that's inside the cell. So it does transiently go through a condition in which solutes can move from inside to outside, or from outside to inside, and then they get excluded. So anyway, I think this is a kind of primitive answer to the question that you raise.
Yeah, I'm. So is it possible that that exclusionary zone becomes thicker and thinner, I guess, as less and more things are needed within the cell and are needed to be excluded from the cell?
Well, need to be. I don't know how one determines about need to be or don't need.
Well,
to
there must be something that's determining. Some things need to get into the cell besides electrons, right?
Well, yeah, yeah, and there certainly, yeah. The cell is good at accepting them, and also and also getting rid of stuff.
Right.
There are flow channels that are inside the cell, um, and we actually found that you can get flow in a narrow channel. Um, if the channel is hydrophilic, as I mentioned before, if you just take a hydrophilic tube and you immerse the tube in water, what will happen is that there will be flow right through the tube. It keeps going and it doesn't stop. If I can tell you more about that if you like, but it's pretty important, I think, because most people presume that you need a pressure to drive flow through a tube, but we found is not necessary at all. In fact, a student of mine who just passed his PhD exam demonstrated that this is at work in our capillaries, that it's not just the heart that pumps the flow, pumps the blood. Everybody knows that, but the vessels themselves can actually advance the blood that's inside of them by a mechanism that we deduce because it works in many cases. As I started to tell you, you just take the tube and immerse it in water, and the flow occurs pretty much automatically. We have a few papers we published and more coming. So inside the cell, if you look through various cells, especially plant cells, but also animal cells, you can see these kinds of flows in narrow streams that are occurring. And we think it's this kind of mechanism that is responsible for that. So it's just
that part of your,
yeah.
I'm sorry, that part of your research, I thought was, I think that was what really, really made me think I probably need to get this guy on the show, because number one, I'm interested in anything that has to do with blood pressure, because that's the one thing that I cannot fix, no matter what I do as my own personal blood pressure. But the idea that one pump of the heart is enough to move all of that, that's like a lot of blood to move through a lot of really tiny spaces. So the idea that there would be other mechanisms throughout the body that were moving blood through the system seemed to be, intuitively, it seemed to be something that was probably true. But I'd never heard anyone, offer a solution to move blood through the body other than a heartbeat. So that part of it was interesting. And you say you've got a PhD, or he just passed his PhD. Who's shown this?
Friday. Did a great job.
He did it Friday. Good job. We'll call him doctor for me, and that's good. I always like when new PhDs come into the world. So that's interesting. In fact, I might want to talk to him as well. Okay, let me back up. Let's go back to the cells for just a minute, because you suggested there's another question I need to ask. Where is the energy that's forming this exclusionary zone? Where is this coming from? How is this happening?
In plants, I'll give you the answer, but first let me tell you a simile. In plants, the first step in the photosynthetic process is the splitting of water into H plus and OH minus. Step one in, I think, 20 steps or so. So the sun is basically giving plants, green plants and some single-celled organisms, giving their energy. And what happens is that when the sunlight hits the plant, it splits the water into H plus, OH minus. So we weren't thinking of that at the time, but we found that light is responsible for splitting the water into the OH minus and H plus, which basically is building the exclusion zone. And we did experiments. It was actually found by a student, an undergraduate student, who was doing what he wasn't supposed to do, like most of the students often do. I slap them on the wrist sometimes, but I'm not enough of an ogre. So the student is doing his experiment, sitting at the bench, and this experiment consists of a tiny chamber, which is as big as this, and some kind of material next to which EZs build. We often use a substance called naphion. Anyway, and we put microspheres, little spheres in, and these spheres are excluded from the exclusion zone. So we can watch the exclusion zone grow at a place where where the microspheres are excluded. We can see it, this exclusion zone keeps growing with time. So the student, and then it levels out to a particular size. So when it reached its terminal size, and which is pretty stable, student took a lamp that was sitting right next to it and shined the lamp on the chamber, and the region of the chamber that received the light, the exclusion zone grew wildly, and other regions that were not illuminated didn't grow. So, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that light is building this kind of exclusion zone. And we found that after this, of course, we did a series of experiments, and we found that the most effective light is infrared light. Infrared light is beyond red, that is a longer wavelength, and it's all around us. If I were to turn off the lights in my office and shut the window, totally dark in here, my camera couldn't record anything. But if I had a camera that was sensitive to infrared, it would record everything, because it's like a night camera. You get a beautiful image because of the infrared that's being generated all around me. The plant would be glowing, I'd be glowing, the books behind me and the whiteboard would all be very clear. So infrared energy is all around us, and it's free. It doesn't cost anything. So because of that, since infrared energy is the most powerful in building easy water and separating, just like first step of photosynthesis, the light is separating the water into H plus and OH minus, very similar. And that's the energy that builds. You might ask, well, why do you need energy to do this? And the reason you need energy is that nature tends toward chaos. If we just let things be, they become chaotic. And if you want to organize them, you need to put in energy. A good example is your office. Yours looks pretty good, but most people, you drop things. If you look at my office, you drop things here and there. It's really easy to do. But if you want to organize the office, create order, you have to put some energy into it. I'm a bit lazy doing that, but it's a general principle of thermodynamics that in order to create order in water as well as anything else, you need to put in energy. So that energy in this case is one of them anyway. We haven't exhausted all possibilities because we don't know what to test, but certainly light, and particularly infrared light, is very important for building this, and it's free for the taking. It's all around us, and therefore there's always easy water. Whenever you have hydrophilic surfaces, and other examples too. So it doesn't necessarily grow next to, if you have water in the glass. It might grow from the glass outward, and not by a trivial amount. But it also could, for example, if you have ions inside the water or salts, we found that easy water could grow around those molecules. See, so there are multiple instances that could lead to the growth of easy water, and certainly inside our bodies. And if we receive light, it builds easy water in our bodies.
How confident are you that it's the light and not the heat?
Yeah, so in my later book, The Fourth Phase of Water, I discussed that issue. They're almost the same. In fact, if you measure infrared light, if you do it with a camera, the camera typically will convert that into temperature because there's a fairly direct conversion of one into the other. But so they're almost the same. But there are certain instances where in the book I discuss in that chapter, using the word temperature gives you a result that doesn't make sense at all. But using infrared does infrared electromagnetic waves. Infrared makes more sense. And I'll give you one example. So we did experiments on easy water with infrared. So we take an infrared camera and we record the exclusion zone and the water beyond the exclusion zone. So as I said, the exclusion zone can typically be half a millimeter or something, and all the water beyond that is still ordinary water. And what the infrared camera records is that the exclusion zone looks cold. It doesn't generate very much infrared energy. And the reason it doesn't is that the molecules inside are not moving around very much. And electromagnetic waves of all kinds are caused by the movement back and forth of charges, but they're not moving very much. So you'd interpret that as cold. And the region beyond generates a lot of infrared energy because things are bouncing around, molecules are moving around and such. But think of it, these structures can persist for sometimes days. So you have a region of EZ sitting here, which is cold by one's standard terminology, and another one sitting right next to it that's warm. Does that make sense that this could persist for so long? Usually temperatures equilibrate. So if you want to interpret this in terms of temperature, you run into this kind of paradox or problem that's not easily resolvable. But if you revert to infrared energy, it's very simple, and you don't have to face this kind of dilemma because you can just say that the exclusion zone is generating a lot of infrared, and the region beyond, not much infrared, and the region beyond is generating a lot of infrared. So I, for one, prefer to stick to the terms infrared energy, in which you could actually define various wavelengths, so that's another advantage. But when you talk about temperature, it's a little bit vague, and it's useful if you touch the stove and it's hot, and you say, ouch, it's hot temperature. You won't talk about infrared energy. But in a scientific context, using temperature sometimes leads to erroneous and meaningless conclusions. So we like to stick with infrared.
Okay, so let's talk about some real-world applications for your research, because there's two that springs to mind pretty easily. Number one, if you can have a stable, source of something that's negatively charged next to something that's positively charged, that seems like the beginnings of a battery. What, are there any applications to applying this to some kind of energy creation, some kind of water cell?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Good point. So one of my students worked on this project. It occurred to us that you simply have water, and the water is separated into EZ water, negatively charged usually, and ordinary water with protons. So the idea was to stick two electrodes, one in the EZ and one in the water beyond, and you got a potential difference. And this is all powered by external light that's there all the time. We can add more to it if we want, but the infrared is there all the time. And we demonstrated that we're able to light a light bulb with energy.
So you lit a light bulb with water?
Yeah, with water. Well, with water next to a surface, a nucleating surface like Naphthalene. And of course, light is really where the energy comes from. You don't get something for nothing. We can't light a light bulb with no energy, but there is energy in the system because the energy is coming ultimately from the sun. Right. And the sun's energy, the infrared, which is roughly half of the sun's energy, is creating this separation of charge. And we put two electrodes and we get a potential difference, and we can exploit this. So yeah, you're right on.
Well, the other one that kind of springs to mind is water purification. If you've got an exclusionary zone that excludes everything, how can you not just, pull water out of the exclusionary zone and have crystal clear drinking water,
We have a couple of patents on exactly that. We formed a company. It's called Fourth Phase Incorporated, not my idea, but one of the people in the company. And the company is working on developments along those lines. We're limited. It's really, in theory, it's really simple because you just pull out the EZ water and there you go. But in order to make it practical, you have to be able to pull out enough EZ water to make it useful. Right. And what we have in the laboratory is basically what we demonstrated, I think very nicely, is that we can do that, and we can get the separation of, we put some junk in the water, and representative junk, we use little tiny spheres, there's microspheres, and in one pass we can get a 200 to 1 separation. So it really does work. It gets rid of that junk. We just collect the easy water that excludes the junk. And we've demonstrated that we can exclude bacteria and so many different substances. So, but the challenge is to start with that, with a laboratory demonstration, and bring it to something that's useful in a practical sense. And that demands that you can not only scale up, but that it works every time consistently. And that's a challenge to do. It's a technological challenge, and we've started to face that challenge. We're looking for investment because it requires money to pay the people to do the developments, and that's I think the limiting factor. So we're trying to do that. We're trying to exploit the idea of energy coming out. We're trying to create a drinking water, since we think that easy water, at least from what we know about it, should be very good for health, and I can explain why later if you ask. And so these are ongoing developments. Thank you. That was good of you to have thought about those.
All right. Well, okay. So let's get back to what this podcast is about, which is nutrition. You hinted a little bit at it. What, I guess my question is there anything that the average person needs to know about easy water that will help them make better nutritional choices?
Yes, I think so. So let me explain. So ideally, your cell is filled with not only macromolecules and ions and such, but also filled with easy or fourth phase water. This is, and as we get older, we get dehydrated, and cellular dehydration corresponds to not enough easy water. Also, if you have a pathology, often it corresponds to a low negative electrical potential, not enough negativity, so to speak. I'm sorry for the terminology, but that's the way it goes. Thank you, Ben Franklin. And so what you want to do to reverse the pathology is to build up easy water. So cancer cells, for example, instead of typical cells of minus 80 or minus 70 or 90 millivolts, maybe only 10 or 20 millivolts negative. Pathological kidney cells, also down to, instead of minus 80 or something, down it's only minus 10, minus 20. In our interpretation, it means there's not enough easy water, because that's where the negativity comes from. So if you don't have enough, you want to build it up again. And that's why many people underline the critical importance of hydration. And hydration, what it really means in the cellular level, if we're right in our assertions, is that it's a buildup of easy water. So you want to build up easy water, and there are several really simple ways to do it. Many of the people who deal in natural medicine and such, and some nutrition, understand that. And I can give you, if you like, a list of 5 or 6 simple ways that you can build your easy water. And building the easy water should contribute to a reversal of pathology.
So more than just drinking it, there are things that you can do to build that up than just rather than just drinking more water.
Yeah, absolutely. So drinking water is one way, because it's the raw material for building EZ. So sure, you don't want to stop drinking water or getting your water from various foods. But another way is to walk out in the sun. So as I mentioned, roughly half the sun's energy is in the infrared range. And the infrared range is exactly what builds easy water. So if you walk out in the sun, especially if you take off your clothing, but even if you don't, your body is receiving infrared energy, and that energy should build easy water inside your body. Okay,
it's funny that you mentioned that, because some really big advances in the health field over the last, 3 or 4 years that I've been following has been red light therapy, and specifically infrared light therapy, where people are standing in front of these red blocks of whatever, and they're claiming to get some benefit from that, and it seems to line up with what you're saying here.
I think so. I think that I've heard of some of these, and I think that they have been unsure of the mechanism. But from our point of view and what we found, the mechanism is very straightforward. It's simply that it builds the easy water to make your cells healthy. That's all. I ran into one clinician in Germany. No, it was in Denmark, but he was from, I think, from Germany. He was attending my lecture, and he came to me afterward. He said, you know, I specialize in infrared treatments. Young women come to me, and they have some facial cancer or something, and the physicians have said, well, we need to operate, but of course they don't want their face to be disfigured. So he exposes their face to infrared light. He said, it's like magic. It absolutely clears up whatever facial problems there are. And I've heard other clinicians doing the same. So yeah, this is one relatively easy way to do it. You can do it either with an infrared lamp, or the better way is the natural way, you know, go into a sauna, either in Finland or the banya in Russia, or as you like. So the heat, basically, as we were talking before, the heat and the infrared are largely the same. And so you're exposing your whole body to a lot of infrared energy. And that infrared energy is what builds easy water. And I think that's the reason why you go in there for 20 minutes and you come out and you feel like $1 million. Because throughout your body, you've built easy water, and building up easy water makes your cells function better, properly, and you feel better as a result. So that's another one.
So I cut you off. You said we can get better easy water with sunlight and just drinking more water. What are some of the other ways you mentioned?
Well, a sauna would be another.
Sauna.
Sauna.
Well, sauna is another one of these things that a lot of people really believe in the healing power of specifically infrared saunas.
Well, we think we've come up with an explanation for why there is healing power, and it's a simple one. It's not complicated. Another one is walking barefoot on the beach. So the question is, well,
it's grounding. That's another one.
Grounding, yeah. But the question is, you know, why should grounding lead to better health? And you know, you can come up with various philosophical or spiritual kinds of reasoning, and they may apply. But also, the Earth is not neutral. I learned only about 10 years ago, something I should have known throughout, because my original education was in electrical engineering. The Earth is not neutral, it's negatively charged. And this is well known, it's just that we don't learn it in this country. In Russia, my friend who told me this, he said, you don't know about this? In Russia, every middle school student knows that the Earth is negatively charged. And so I guess maybe our education is deficient, because the evidence is really clear. I don't know of anybody who challenges it. It's just that they don't teach it because it seems unimportant, I guess. So if you connect yourself to that negative Earth, what happens is electrons from the Earth can enter into your body. And we found experimentally that if you stick an electrode in water and pass negative charge, pass electrons into it, that water converts to easy water. You see, so it means you connect yourself to the Earth in one of a number of different ways. You get more easy water and you feel better. So I think it's a simple reason as to why earthing or grounding is good for health. Okay, so that's, I think, a fourth one. A fifth one is maybe more closer to nutrition. There are two ways. One of them is to do juicing. So, you know, a lot of people have caught on onto this. You take the plant, you put it through this machine that squeezes the juice out of the plant, and you drink it. So why should this be healthful? It's helpful, I think, because what you're doing is you're squeezing out the water from inside the cells of the plant. And this water contains lots of easy water. And these cells are healthy. The leaves are new and freshly grown. So you squeeze out the intracellular water and drink it, you're basically drinking easy water. And so presumably this is replacing the missing easy water that's inside your body. And that's why many naturopaths and other practitioners recommend this as maybe one of the simplest and most effective expedients for becoming healthy. So and finally, well, there are some more, but finally, there are certain substances that everybody knows for millennia, starting from Ayurvedic times and ancient Chinese times, substances that are good for you, right? And they'll do wonders in restoring health. So one of those is, for example, turmeric. Another one is coconut water or coconut oil. Even aspirin from the bark of the willow tree. It does so many positive things to your body, and besides just curing a headache. And the question that arose to us is, if each one of these has been established throughout the millennia as being good for health, and it doesn't impact only one thing, but each one of those impacts so many things throughout the body, there must be some central agent that is responsible. So what is it? Either it could have a dozen different mechanisms or one mechanism that applies everywhere. And by Occam's razor, you think, one mechanism applying everywhere makes more sense. And what could that be? Well, it could be in water because water is everywhere. So we came up with a hypothesis that the reason these agents are so good at promoting health is that they build easy water. We tested it by doing experiments for each one of those, and we found that among the ones we tested, including ghee, by the way, among those that we tested, every one of them builds easy water in concentrations that are sort of normal for the body. So that is maybe number 6 or so. These substances known to be effective for health, I think they really are effective for health, and the mechanism may lie simply in buildup of easy water.
So I know in reading your book, one of the points you try to make is that one of the reasons that this fourth phase of water wasn't discovered sooner is because people kind of assumed that we knew everything we needed to know about water, and there wasn't a fourth phase. And so you think you've discovered something that was kind of left by the wayside, I guess, as science progressed. So in order to keep this from happening, I think in other areas, you've created an institute, I guess I should say, that's dedicated to finding these branches of science that don't have a whole lot of leaves on them, I guess we'll call them. Can you tell us a little bit about that? What is that?
It's called the Institute for Venture Science,
Okay.
IVS. And the IVS, by the way, in case you want to check the website, it's IV as in intravenous, ivscience.org. Very simple. It's a nice website designed by my son, who's an artist. Yeah. So here's the rationale. If you were to ask your colleague to name a handful of scientific revolutions that have occurred in the past, say, 30, 40 years, I've tried to do that. And the responses of most people is, huh? What are you talking about? But think about it. Think about revolutions that happened, say, 100 years ago, quantum mechanics, splitting of the atom, the genetic code, stuff like that. Can you name one, even, that scientific revolution that's occurred, say, in the past 30 or 40 years that's equivalent to any of those?
Well, I mean, in my lifetime, we've had the internet, cell phones. That seems fairly revolutionary.
Totally, and those are technologies. I'm talking about fundamental science.
Oh, okay.
There have been many revolutionary technologies, but it's usually the fundamental science that allows for the buildup of these technologies, which are then useful for solving all kinds of problems that we have. But it's really hard to think of more than a handful of these that have happened in the past 20 or 30 years, despite huge funding from various funding agencies, national, international, and so on. And the question is why? And we think we understand why, because science has become more institutionalized, and as it becomes institutionalized, it sets boundaries on what areas can be pursued and which ones can't be pursued, because they're out of the too far out of the mainstream. And the people who make the decisions about who gets the money to pursue their hypotheses are usually the people who are at the head of the particular field. So, for example, if I come up with a theory that the Earth is round, and everybody else thinks it's flat. So imagine what happens to my proposal. I submit an application to XYZ funding agency, and I say, I've seen satellite photos and it looks spherical to me. And I took a plane trip, and I took off from Seattle, where I live. I went west, and I went to Tokyo, and then after that I wound up in Moscow, and from there in London, and then New York, and back to Seattle. And I made it all around. So it's kind of hard to understand the flat Earth. And I even looked out the window looking for the edge of the flat Earth, and I could never find it. So, hey, you guys, I know that all of you think that the Earth is flat, but it looks like the evidence is it might be round. So what do you think would be the response to that? Well, most people would think, oh, well, sure, this seems so important that certainly would have very high priority for funding. But actually, the people who are the reviewers are the experts in the field, and those people are the flat Earth people. And the last thing they want is for them to get displaced in their exalted position as the heads of the field. It's human nature. It can't, it's very difficult to change that. We want to change it because this system is leading to no or very few scientific revolutions. And even the people in the funding agencies understand that this is a problem, but it's a difficult one to solve because there are huge institutions with a lot of inertia. So we created the Institute for Venture Science, and we receive only proposals that challenge mainstream thinking, where mainstream thinking isn't working very well. We sift through those. We pick out the ones that, if correct, will really shake the earth. And we ask for full proposals. We get the full proposals. We vet them very seriously, more so, I think, than any other agency. And we've now picked out 5 of them that we think have the potential to, if correct, to create scientific revolutions. And the revolutions are really important because the problems that we're facing in society now are mounting, huge and mounting, and they need to be solved. And often, besides the political aspects, they can be solved by scientific revolutions, which then allow for new technologies which can solve problems. So we're looking for the scientific revolutions. Basically, we're looking for people who would like to donate. This is not something that any government would likely support. And so we're depending on private donors, people who have done well and are looking for something meaningful to which they can contribute. I think this may satisfy that kind of need. So we're excited about this because we think that this will inevitably bring new, fresh thinking and scientific revolutions in the future.
Fantastic. Well, guys, we're going to put links to ivscience.org there in the show notes. You can find that at mysugarfreejourney.com/podcast. I'm going to put a link to his book, The Fourth Phase of Water. We'll also put a link to Cells, Gels, and the Engine. I forget the name of it, but his previous book. We'll put a link to that as well. Dr. Pollack, is there anything, do you have social media or anything else that if people want to follow along with what you're doing where they can interact?
Well, we have a Facebook page, and it was my son who told me, Dad, you've got to have a Facebook page. Not the sort of thing I do, but we have one.
Good.
And, we put some stuff on there that could be interesting to general audience. So I think those are basically the ones. You've hit them. Thank you. Yeah.
Perfect. All right, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And Dr. Pollack, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care.
All right, guys. We'll be right back with some more information.